Good morning, folks. Let's pause recording for now. Okay, so we should be recording again. I will share screen and pull the slides up. Okay, let's go back to startup. Don't look. So you guys should be able to see my slide screen, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, but we're going to start with a discussion about final examination procedures. So Hyunsuk and I thought we knew what we were doing, and then the university, because of the Wild West that we are operating inside of, rules being changed all the time, the university sent something out last week that as a group we need to discuss. So the original plan, so our final is it 4th of May, the Monday?
Yes.
So that's going to be what, week on Monday, I think. And the original plan was, like we did the midterm, that we've got a fixed time slot in the academic planner. I think it's 10 to 12, might be 11 to 1, but it's not our usual class time. It's a Monday. We've got a 2-hour block of time. And prior to COVID-19 and remote working, we would have been meeting in Bueller in the usual room for the 2-hour block of time, doing this on paper, done. When that went by the wayside, the plan was that we would run this like midterm 2, that we would have the exam open across that 24-hour period. You guys could take it whenever you liked in the 24-hour period, but once you started taking it, it would basically start a clock, and then the exam would only be available to you for a fixed time period. So that was our intent. But the uni has come down with so I looked carefully. There are policies in there. The bit that affects us is not policy, it's encouragement. They would like us to either stick to the 2-hour block of time or give you complete freedom over when you take the exam. Not that day, any time in the exam period. So they were like one of those two extremes. No flexibility at all, or any time in the exam period. And I'm not willing, and I'll explain why, to do any time in the exam period. I think it would actually disadvantage you guys as a class. The reason for that is I would normally set aside time for being available to you and provide resources to be available to you for revision during the early part of the exam period. And I would have Hyunsuk do the same. So we'd be talking about, when next week we might offer a couple of hours of office hour-like time, and we would go through the practice test and take questions. We would lose the ability to do that. Basically, our ability to do anything would shut down this week if we then had to say the exam's available at any point. It's like having an exam on the first morning. So we'd lose that. The other thing we learned with midterm 2 is that we need time on the back end to troubleshoot in case someone has a problem taking the test online. So after midterm 2, we had to spend a few days running down individuals who, for example, couldn't see figures displayed. And then we had to create a means for them to take that under timed conditions for the questions they missed out on. So we had to do stuff like that, and it took us days, which is why the results were a bit slower. And I anticipate we'll have to do some of that after the final. So I can't have the final butt right up against the end of the marking period for the same reason. So I'm not willing to follow the uni's encouragement of opening the exam for the whole time. I think you guys will be mad if I go to the other extreme they've suggested of saying it has to be in that 2-hour period. So I'm going to suggest that we do our own thing. We had a plan of giving you guys the 24-hour period, and you could take it anywhere near you liked. As a concession towards what the uni's asking, I don't mind opening up that 24 hours a bit more, because I can appreciate if someone's got, and this is what the uni's about, if someone's got 2 exams on the same day, it's hard enough for somebody to find a time and a space when you can get peace and quiet and a stable connection. It's going to be worse if you've got to find that for 2 exams on the same day, which someone might be facing. And so I'm willing to kind of do a halfway house if you guys are willing to do it, whereby maybe we open the exam so it's more like 4 days or something, and you can take it anywhere inside a 4-day stretch. Again, once you start, the stopwatch starts. What I'm not willing to do is go to the full exam period like they asked, because we wouldn't get any revision time, and I wouldn't get any time to troubleshoot problems that people might have on the exam. Right, but anything like this, we have to agree as a class. That's what it says in the syllabus. That's what we always do. So I'd like to invite you guys to offer some comments.
I think that sounds like a really good idea. I don't know if but you should probably check with somebody who has more exams for exam period for this semester than I do, because I only have 2, and they're like a week apart.
So others, if we made as a concession that you could take it anywhere in more like a 4-day stretch or something, is that concession enough? Do you need me to look even more than that? And if so, what do you need?
For me, that works perfect. I'm in the same boat as Brianna, that where I don't, my exams are not going to be on the same day. So I'm good with that, because I would like the extra study time and time to be able to ask questions.
Thank you. Any others? Is anyone really bunched up on exams? I've got someone in chat. Don't know what that means. Open a window is okay. Yeah, so that's Michael. Michael's on board with it. Any others? Still coming on chat. Yeah, 4 days being suggested. Is anyone really mad that I'm not willing to countenance the unis open up for the whole exam period? Is that putting anyone in a real bind? Okay, if it is a real problem and you just don't want to speak up, because I can appreciate talking on Zoom is daunting for some, shoot me an email quickly afterwards, because otherwise I will proceed and I'll be talking to Hyunsuk in our TAing meeting on the basis that we can do things like a revision stretch next week, because the next stage for us is to get you guys, if we can do that, is to get you guys revision resources and then to talk about when we're going to put in these hours of time to be available to you. So that's the next thing we will do. Once we do that, we're basically committing that the exam will not happen until we're a ways into the study period, so we can have a revision stretch first. So as I say, if what I'm suggesting is a real problem, opening it for a few more days, like 4 days or something, if that's a real problem, leaves you in a really tight bind, follow up with me by email very quickly after today, before we start advertising revision sessions and things, so I can look at what we need to do. I appreciate you guys probably still have questions on the exam. That I needed to get past that one first of all, because that guidance came from the uni on Friday, and I needed to work out how we were going to resolve it before I can progress stuff like revision. So I'll have more for you on Thursday about the final. Right now, the plan is that you will get a practice final and we'll get revision sessions, and I'll tell you dates and times for those soon. Right now for you guys, I suspect if you've got time on assessed material, it's probably going on coursework, unless you've already finished and submitted it. Coursework is due by 4 p.m. on Thursday. Please, please, please do not get late penalties, right? Late penalties coming at 10% a day. That really knocks down people's grades. I've been doing grades projections for plenty of you. The courseworks and the questions for practitioners help. Particularly those who find exams hard, it lifts up those scores. It can't do that if you get late penalties and things. So get it submitted, due Thursday, 4 p.m. You can submit it right now. No need to wait if you're already done. We have one external speaker left. We've got that one recorded. It's about the Southeast Asian Australian Flyway. We will have that for you on Thursday. I want to see where we get to with material. The person basically gave us too much. So what we will probably do is have the bit that's most germane, so because there's a lot of kind of background biology, we'll have the bit that's most germane to her role, to her organization, to what they do, because that's really what we're after from those speakers. And we'll give you the rest of it as a resource for you if you're particularly interested to go into the background biology. We'll provide the whole recording for you to do that. So after today, I'll speak to Hyun Suk about how much time on Thursday we can give over to that. Thursday will be sort of finishing out content, that external speaker, and then sort of just wrapping up and looking over what we've covered across the set of classes. Any questions about what's coming up? Okay, on we go. Let's shrink this down because you guys won't be able to see. Okay, so for today, we are starting into this last bit of the course. And as has been the case multiple times, so like last week, institutions, last week, Endangered Species Act, you guys could probably see, right? The ESA could easily support, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks of classes. If I added in other acts, other examples, then we could do a whole policy class that would last a semester. So like, as has been the case recurrently, the lectures are sort of a taste. I feel like the table of contents of a book, you get an idea, you get a sense of what's involved, but if you really want a deep understanding of a topic, you should take specialized courses in that topic. And that is very, very, very true today. So today we are gonna give you a flavor of restoration ecology. And then the next, after that, is a flavor of ex situ conservation. These very clearly are just a flavor. It's questionable whether they live in a conservation biology class at all, as opposed to being sort of separate and distinct disciplines and topics in their own right. But I feel like we should at least talk about them and the connections to them. So really what we're talking about is, what do you do? What can you do once everything else has gone wrong? So the strategies bit, what we've been doing for weeks, has been about how do we avoid things getting to a really bad place? How do we step in? Maybe we'll make protected areas. Maybe we'll encourage conservation on the wider landscape. Maybe we'll pass policy safeguards and try and implement things to stop us really getting into a hole with ecosystems. This is what happens if you don't. Or perhaps better stated, what happens where you don't. So we're going to talk about how to restore ecosystems once already degraded. After that, and this is like the ecosystem habitat kind of version, then we'll do the species version, where we talk about ex situ conservation. The readings for both, it's Greva and Marvier, 310 to 337. But we're going to start in restoration. So what is restoration ecology? Protected areas, related strategies focus on conserving ecosystems from current and future threats. The counterpart then is, what do we do once ecosystems or species, actually ecosystems, are already degraded? And that's the focus of restoration ecology. The slides today, when I wrote them, there's a lot of sort of bad schematics of how to do restoration ecology, not quantitative, not experimental, bad schematics. So I've got some of those bad schematics. I've got some actual study designs too. And I'll talk about the some of the hands-on flavor of it as well. But you'll see schematics like this as we go. You'll find them, there's plenty of them. The goal of restoration ecology is to restore an ecosystem to some kind of historical condition. Hence the word restore. What that means, though, depends on the project. So they vary in how degraded they are to begin with, and they vary in what someone's restoration goal is. So you will hear people talk about, I want to restore to pristine condition. If you actually go and visit some restoration sites, and there's plenty around Tennessee, you can go and see them, then you'll find sometimes it just means there is something green, right? Some vegetative cover, and that counts as restored. So quite different goals. And so the schematic's trying to show this, that how close do you want to get back to historic conditions, relatively relaxed, in which case we're sort of reclaiming a site from acute threats. We're doing toxic cleanup. maybe stabilizing an eroding bank side. More ambitious, maybe we're doing some revegetation, maybe we're doing some habitat creation. Very ambitious, we're trying to get back to pre-disturbance conditions. Here's what it looks like. So this is from your text. This is obviously a forest road going in for forestry, and then after the cutting is done, they've restored the road to try to recreate or re-establish the native ecosystem and make restore ecosystem function. So that is what restoration can look like before and after. So here's a study giving you an idea of some of the science. It's from Restoration Ecology. They've got their own journal, their own society. I picked it because it, just as an example, it does a good job of illustrating many of the things that a restoration, the science of a restoration project wants to have. Right, so it was done in North Australia. It was a bauxite mining site. So this is a surface mine. You guys have seen images of surface mining. They're gonna take off the top surface and leave this pit, right? And so it is very, very, very disturbed. It's in tropical North Australia, and the major surrounding habitat is open eucalypt forest. Afterwards, they have to restore the site that they have sort of ripped the surface off from. Right, so what does the restoration involve? Well, they're going to have to establish new topsoil. They're going to need to get some vegetative cover back in, and for that, they were actually reseeding native plants. And a core thing for the study design, the science of this, is that the restoration was done at different times. And this is pretty common, right? If you're particularly if you're dealing with someone who's doing mineral extraction, they will get a concession. And that's true for timber cutting too. They'll get a concession for the whole property, which will be quite big, but they won't use the whole property at once. Instead, the disturbance will spread as they work on different bits of that property gradually through time, which means the restoration effort can start once the first bit of mineral extraction is finished, or the first bit of clear cutting is finished. They can start restoring in those places so they can sort of follow the disturbance across the site. And that's what they were doing here, right? That they've been gradually moving across this mining site as mineral extraction is completed. And so the science design is going to use those different timings of restoration activity to try and measure progress towards undisturbed conditions. So how fast are we recovering? So that's this language of chronosequence, different sequence through time. They're going to look at the different disturbed sites, and then they've got 6 adjoining controls. These are sites nearby that never saw the mining damage. So they're going to compare to that. And so here's their study design. They've got the differently disturbed sites. They've got a number of sample plots in each of those, and then the age. So the sites classed as A they've only been restored for 2 to 3 years, whereas the ones classed as E have been restored for more like 15 to 20 years, so about 20 years on average. And then you've got these 6 undisturbed controls as well. Right, so that's their design for this thing. So what do they find? The early plots, the plots that have only been restored recently, are dominated by short-lived acacias. So there are plants on them, but it's short-lived things. Long-lived eucalypts, which is what's in the undisturbed plots, come later. So the older plots, you start to see eucalypts coming in. The restored plots gradually start to recover attributes of the undisturbed reference sites. So let's try and see that. So here is the most recently disturbed, next most recently restored, next most recently restored, and these are the ones that were restored like 20 years ago. And then here you've got the undisturbed sites. And some indicators you might look at. You might look at canopy height. You might look at the size of the tallest tree, how much canopy cover, or we're after eucalypts, so you might look at the ratio. Is it dominated by eucalypts or acacias? And then you can see these things. So this is the undisturbed site over here. You can see these indicators start to trend up, even though they haven't reached the undisturbed state. So the tallest tree height, the trees are getting taller, but they're still quite a way short of the undisturbed site. Canopy cover is increasing, almost caught up to the undisturbed site. Eucalypts, which should be the dominant, are to begin with, there are not that many of them, it's mostly acacias, about even, and then gradually start to see recovery of the eucalypts, but a long way short of the dominance they have in the undisturbed sites. So we start to see some gradual recovery, but it's not all the way there, and that's after 20 years. So here's another example, right? This is going to show you species richness and mean abundance. So let's see if we can get the right symbols. So the broken lines, solid boxes, that's that one, are the mean number of species. The open triangles, mean bird abundance, and then the unbroken lines, the total richness. So this one here is total species richness. And then here we go with the mean number of species of birds, and you can see it gradually increasing towards the undisturbed site. And here we go with the abundance of birds, gradually increasing towards the undisturbed sites. So we see this gradual progression. At the same time, there are things that are missing. There are still species haven't shown up. And there's differences in the composition, so that's just richness. The key ones that are missing, it's a particular kind of guild. It is hollow nesting species that depended on the old eucalypts. So if the oldest trees you've got are only 20 years old, species that depend on old growth aren't going to be there. Okay, so what about our general principles? What kinds of characteristics does this study have that would apply to many such examples? The first is that successional sequence matters, right? You can't restore an ecosystem out of a box. There's natural processes that have to play out, and succession takes time. So you can get to a somewhat restored system over 20 years, but forest succession, it takes much longer than that. To understand how you're doing, another thing that's very common to these is to choose some reference sites, some kind of controls, choose some metrics, like our ratio of eucalypts to acacias. That's going to be specific to this study, but choose some metrics that make sense to the study you're doing, and then track progression of the metrics towards the controlled sites. So that's a very common aspect to a restoration project design. Okay, questions at this point?
What do you mean by choosing a metrics?
Yeah, this is not a good question, Michael. If we go back to, what was it, lecture 4? I asked you guys, I gave you guys a discussion, like a little challenges, little groups of choosing things you would monitor to understand the ecological condition of a patch of forest in Appalachia. And we talked, and you want to understand the state of biodiversity. And we talked about how, you know, all the aspects of biodiversity. There's the habitat, the ecosystem, the species, the populations, the genetics, the functions. You'd like to know about all of these. And I was like, yeah, you got to choose 4 things. What are your 4 things? So in a project, you don't get to survey everything. You don't get to monitor everything. So these measurements are their metrics. So they're obviously focused on vegetative condition as a core thing they care about. They've gone for relatively easy to survey things. So canopy height is actually quite easy to survey. Height of the tallest tree is not bad to survey. Canopy cover is easy to survey. Eucalypt to acacia ratio, that's also pretty easy. And you'll note they're not going to species. So that's pretty easy to survey. So these are things that don't take a huge amount of effort to assess. They're still going to do it across all those sites. Those would be their metrics that are supposed to tell us about ecosystem structure and function. They obviously thought, you know what? We also want to think about how other species are using those habitats. We'll use birds as an indicator group. And for birds, we'll look at total richness, average abundance, mean richness across the plot. So again, those things are metrics they chose. Do they tell us everything about biodiversity of the birds? No, they don't. They don't really do a good job of getting a composition. They say nothing about genetics. But those are indicators that are surveyable. And they've decided that with a small set of these, they're going to be able to evaluate whether the site is restored or how restoration is going. Does that answer it, Michael?
Thank you. Yeah, it's very clear now.
Other questions at this point? Okay, so these are up on the screen just now. You've got some of the principles that would go into a restoration project, right? And you could probably have written this list out yourself. Oh, go away, Skype. I don't know what that's about. Right, has the threat that led to the decline of the ecosystem been removed? What's the starting point for the restoration project? What's the objective or the envisioned end point for the project? How's progress towards the objective going to be assessed? That's this business of metrics and indicators. What restoration methods are you going to use? So these are some of the basic principles, right? You guys, I'm sure, could have come up with this list yourselves. It would take you about 5 minutes. What I thought I would do, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll pick some examples from here and show you the kinds of things that live underneath. So I'm going to start with what's the starting point for the restoration project. And it's not a subtle point, right? Restoration is easier if you don't massively disturb the site to begin with, and if you have some remnant habitat nearby. So this figure's from Andrew Pullen's book. I told you this discipline was full of schematics. This is Pullen's conservation biology book, a different text. So here's what an undisturbed site might look like. You've got a mixed soil horizon, you've got some topography, you've got some native vegetation. This would be pretty commonly what would be done for a development, right? That you would remove the vegetation and you would level the site. That's done for almost everything. Restoring from there is still work, right? You can see the complexity we have, and you can think back to the example of the forest road and what it took to move the road, right, from this highly compacted and flattened to this, right? That is, but there was vegetation nearby they could draw across some of the old brush and things. That's more like this level of restoration. The bauxite mine is like this, including they've actually gone into the bedrock. But the bauxite mine, they've taken off all of the soil, right? So they've destroyed the soil structure, they've removed the vegetation, and they've disturbed the bedrock. So restoring from there is a lot harder. So restoration's easier if you've got some remnant habitat nearby. That creates the possibility for things to seed in or for some transplanting. And it means that whatever you're going to restore from, at least you're with locally adapted seed stock and things. It's easier if the disturbance is not as massive. Restoring this is very difficult, restoring that much easier. And one of the hardest, we talked a bit, particularly in lectures about the ESA and things, about habitat creation. Right, habitat creation, that's not restoration. That is going out and establishing a habitat somewhere where it was not before. So going and finding a piece of, I mean, I've seen it done with areas that were never wetland, like somewhat upland areas with the wrong hydrology and people trying to make wetlands on those sites. That, which is common under compensatory mitigation schemes, is much harder because you might not even be in the right kind of system for the habitat you're trying to put in there. So the next principle is, what's the objective? What are you trying to achieve with your restoration? And I'd say that this is where those who do restoration work and those who sort of advocate depart. If you do restoration work, I would say that you would accept pretty quickly that complete restoration to pre-disturbance state is almost never, I said often not, I say almost never possible. Right? For even a moderate level of disturbance, you're not going to get back an undisturbed ecosystem. Sometimes it's not even a meaningful thing to talk about. Right? So I'm from the UK, and if people said, I want, and you'll hear this, I've gone to meetings and people say, I want to restore to the historic ecosystem. And I'll stick up my hand and say, well, which one do you mean? Because the native ecosystems of the UK is the Great Caledonian Forest, which has not been on those islands for about a millennium since they were cleared. So for someone to start talking about restoring to native ecosystems, you're talking about an ecosystem that hasn't been there for 1,000 years. Doesn't make any sense. Right. More typically, what the actual goal turns into is, what do you mean by that? Well, what do we mean by that is some ecosystem functions. Right? We want some of the ecosystem functionality we had, even if we don't get back everything, even if those hollow nesting birds we talked about before haven't come back yet. And so where you draw that line becomes quite important to how successful a restoration project is going to be and what kind of method you're going to have to use. Also how long it'll take to get there. And so again, this is one of these schematics that you start with a degraded ecosystem. You need to think about how many species you're trying to get back, how much of the ecosystem complexity you're trying to get back, how much are you after the original sort of levels of biomass and nutrients, and then you can get off at different points. So this is a progression from degraded to the original ecosystem, and you might accept, you know what, I'll accept some green stuff. Replacement using a few species. Or actually, I still want something that's quite species rich, even if they're not all there yet. And for that, I'm going to have to work a bit harder. A very common theme that people will raise if you talk about the objective of restoration projects is that they will be self-sustaining. So the restoration is only complete if we can walk away and that ecosystem will persist. Not if we walk away and then we come back 5 years later, everything's died off and it's just sort of collapsed again. That's the standard that habitat creation projects particularly fail. We're able to maintain a habitat in a place it might not belong while we stick around and do lots of interventions. So some of those wetlands I mentioned are actually irrigated. So we're able to do that as long as we're involved, but if we walk away, it will convert back and it won't go to its original conditions. The goal setting aspects, so what's the objective, what's the envisioned endpoint? One thing that sort of bedevils restoration efforts is that we don't always know what the original condition was. And we often have funny ideas about the original condition. So your book talks about something called shifting baselines. And this is the idea that each generation recalls the ecosystem as it was often when they were kids, that's what counts as being native, not as it actually once was. So this figures from your book to try and measure this. I mean, it's a hard thing to measure. Anecdotally, hear about it all the time. Hard thing to measure. This is your book trying to show a study measuring it. So this was asking fishermen in the Gulf of California about how many groupers they would have caught in their single best day of fishing. And if they asked people who've been fishing recently, so the younger generation, they're like, oh, my best day's catch is like 3 to 5 groupers. So if you could get me back to there, that would be restoration. But if you ask their grandparents are saying, no, 20 to 25 in a day. So if you chose that as your baseline, you would set really much more ambitious goals for restoration than if you asked people what was normal and they talked about here. And this is recurrent. This is a fisheries example, but it's recurrent elsewhere. So I know guys who are involved in a UK charity and NGO, the RSPB. They had long wanted a site that was next door. The site was had been used by the government for forestry after World War II. It was full of non-native pine, planted in rows. There was no wildlife in it. It was like a desert. And they wanted those trees off and they wanted to restore the initial wetland habitat that should have been there. They started doing the restoration and there was a huge public outcry because this conservation organization were removing forest. And the locals thought the forest was native and that was nature. The forest had only been there for sort of 40 or 50 years and it didn't belong there at all, but it didn't matter it had been sort of changed how people thought about what was natural. So that's this idea of shifting baselines. I've also put idea because we've worked in a system before that I'll mention in a second. And when we asked people about what was historical, they told us, they gave us a very consistent answer. But in that situation, we actually had data, and we went back and looked, and the answer was wrong. So in that instance, what the older generations were telling us was actually not what had happened. They had false recall. So it's a tricky thing to try and pin down what people think was natural. Another thing that makes this difficult is it does have a vision of ecosystems as rather static. And that's not true, right? We know ecosystems are dynamic. We've talked about it for years. You guys have studied it for years. So here's some data evidencing it. This is that system I mentioned. We had data going back to 1913. We were very fortunate that a naturalist had sort of stomped everywhere and mapped out habitats and things. And then it had been redone in the 40s and more recently a few times as well. And this is the overall proportion of squares that were things like dwarf shrub moorland, that were scrub, that were woodland habitat. And that's the ones that, so this is Martin went out and did it. These are ones that were in their original state, stayed in their original state. So that's why it's a 1, because to begin with, they're all in the 1913 state. This is the proportion that are still in that state if you go and survey them in the 40s or in the 80s. This is the overall proportion of squares in each of those habitat types. So in here, we've got the dwarf shrub moorland and the scrub and things. And all the figures designed to show you is we weren't losing habitats. Right? Everyone would tell you we're losing habitats. We weren't losing habitats. What was happening though is that if you went to a point in the landscape, what it was changed. Right? It moved between different habitat types. So the ecosystems there weren't static, and saying I'm going to restore to a given habitat, you were basically chasing a moving target. Even though it wasn't a loss signal, it was just a natural conversion signal. So that's how do we choose our objective. Next is, how are you going to assess progress towards the objective? Why don't I take a question or two just now before I roll on? Questions so far?
So I have the feeling that restoration is more of something of human interest, not a natural kind of thing.
So restoration is being done. I don't know of situations where it's hard to think of situations where humans are actively restoring because of natural disturbance. I guess we could look at some fire things, maybe. Really what people are talking about, Michael, are situations where humans have heavily disturbed some ecosystem. And humans don't want to live with that ecosystem as an eyesore and a health hazard for ages. So they try to do something to restore it to an ecological condition they're happier living with. That how far they go, how far they progress it, what they choose to prioritize, all of those are ultimately human decisions. If they left the site alone, there would be some succession. It would be an open question as to if you left it alone for long enough, how much of the original ecosystems might come back through natural successional processes. It would take a very long time, and certainly some things we do to ecosystems would not be reversed by a natural successional sequence. So human interests are woven throughout, for sure.
Thank you.
Other questions at this point? Okay, so let's pick a different principle. How will progress towards the objective be assessed? So comparison with undisturbed reference sites, like the bauxite mine example, those are pretty common. This is the picture from your book that goes with this bit of text. it makes the point, but it's also a bit weird because you would never use these as reference sites for each other. So these are coral reefs that have seen relatively little disturbance. These are coral reefs that have seen, in this case, fishing as a disturbance. Right, the obvious difference, there are some big piscivores around in these systems. That means there is much less planktivores around, and some of it cascades through to there's much less algae around. So the disturbed sites where we've taken out the piscivores, we end up with communities dominated by little planktivorous fish or covered in algae. I think it's a pretty contrived set of pictures. But the principle that we would tend to be looking at progress on a restoration project by looking at a comparison to an undisturbed site, that is common to many restoration projects. It has many of the same experimental design concerns that we talked about in the protected areas lecture. So you're comparing impacted to control, and you need to think about, well, how do I choose my control? You have to worry about whether the impacted is a random sample with respect to the things you're going to measure. The thing that Michael asked about, we then have to choose metrics. What are we actually going to measure? What are you going to survey abundance of, in this case, the piscivores? In the eucalypts case, you're going to look at the ratio of eucalypts to acacias. You need to decide what it is you're going to measure. So is it density of a particular species of interest? Is it species richness of what groups? Is it nutrient levels? What are you going to measure? You can't measure everything. And the choice of those metrics matters, right? That's going to decide whether some very expensive restoration project is deemed to be making good progress or not to make good progress. I'd say it is most important when the restoration is being done to meet a regulatory requirement. So that's in a situation where the developer is having to pay for this to be done in order to meet some regulatory requirement. The developer has no incentive, likely, to do the restoration from out of the good of their heart, and it's costing them money. So they want to pay as little as possible to deliver exactly what will lift this regulatory burden off them. So they will focus on sort of restoration of the metrics you asked about. The situation of the habitat creation of wetlands I mentioned, the metrics the person had been given was density of wetland associated tree species. And that's why they were irrigating an upland site, because they had at that upland site these native tree species planted at exactly the right density. So they delivered the metric they had been asked to deliver. We got nothing that we wanted. People were thinking that would somehow signal ecosystem function, and it didn't. You got the density of trees you asked for, and that was it. So the choice of metrics gets pretty critical. Right, next one. What restoration methods will be chosen? Some, again, photos from your book, right? So this is a disturbed site. This is covered in toxics. So sulfur dioxide, it's denuded the landscape. It's changed the pH of the soil. So what do they have to do? So firstly, they covered it in limestone, right? So this stuff is not subtle science, right? They go out and they cover this thing in limestone. Then they go and they allow, in this case, there was some native trees nearby, so they allowed colonization by things to seed in. Often you would actually have to go in and plant. So a major restoration project I know well from the UK, they helicoptered in little cuttings, because it was up at a high upland site, there was a lot of soil erosion. They helicoptered in, hanging off the bottom of the helicopter, little cuttings of the plants they wanted, and then they sprayed them in strips across the landscape to try and cover it. So it's not, it's quite hands-on work. Sometimes successional processes will do the job itself. Other times you may need to do some active intervention. So you may need to treat the soil. You may need to do replanting. When plants are young, you may need to protect the saplings, or herbivores just come and take them all. So differing degrees of active management might be needed. And again, bad schematic time. In the background, we face the challenge that often we're dealing with small spatial scales that have seen acute disturbance. And the processes we want to restore actually play out over large spatial scales We're not given very long to do it. They take a long time to restore. And if we wish to measure them, we'd like really detailed measurements, and we end up with really coarse ones. So the alert just being that some processes you might want to restore, some things you might want to talk about, they may play out over big spatial and temporal scales, but restoration projects are usually small scale and short term. Right, and now we're going to give a couple of examples. So two of the canonical restoration projects studied by people all over the world. So the first is Guanacaste. So Guanacaste is a tropical dry forest in Costa Rica. 60,000 hectares of degraded pasture, right? So this is grazing land, has been restored to young tropical dry forest. And if you're thinking about an ecosystem that is in trouble in the world, a lot of people think about tropical moist forest, tropical dry forest is in real trouble. So 60,000 hectares have been restored to young, so early successional dry forest in 15 years. The target is to get to 110,000 hectares. This is what it looks like before. So this is what they're going for. This is the young version. They want to get an old successional version of this, but this is what they start from, right? So an African grass, so invasive grass dominated pasture, that's sort of locked in. It's locked in because it's maintained by a fire cycle. And also the forest trees you want don't germinate off their own steam in the pasture, even if they seed in, right? So we need to do both wildfire suppression, and then we need to help the seeds get into the pasture and to germinate. And this is where the challenge comes, right? So the way the plants tend to germinate in the wild is that a native species eats the fruit, carries the seeds, poops, and the seed is germinated by passing through the gut tract of the animal. And that both helps the seed disperse and triggers germination. But to do that, of course, you need to have the animals. And if you haven't got the ecosystem, they aren't there. Right, and so this is where I think of the restoration ecologists as my wellies on cousins. Right, so wellies is a British expression for rubber boots. Right, they are, so restoration ecologists I've known over the years, I've had a number of very good colleagues who do it, I love them to death. They are very, very hands-on. They're not sort of super finessey designs. It's let's go out, try something and see what happens. So another UK example, they were trying to change drainage regimes. So the experiments were things like, we're gonna go and chuck hay bales in the stream. Next, we'll go and chuck chicken wire bales in the stream. Next, we'll go and chuck something else in the stream and just see which one triggers the closest restoration of the flow regime that we want to have. And that philosophy, to my mind, is typified. Just have a go, try something, don't finesse, don't be finicky about this. We've got to get hands-on, is typified by this Guanacaste project, right? And this issue of how are they going to get these trees into the pasture and to germinate when they're supposed to go through the gut tract of native animals that aren't there anymore. So here is an example of the success. This is the seed of the native plant germinating in this case, horse poop. So what did they do? They said, well, it'd be good if we got the native species of animals. We don't have them. So instead, they got a bunch of horses and donkeys. In a bucket of grain, they included some of the native seeds. Animal eats the food, they let it wander around in this pasture, pooping, and that has the effect of sort of recreating animal dispersal and germination of the seeds that let these native trees come in. So very hands-on. At the same time, so they've had success, right? That from here to there, huge success, 60,000 hectares. At the same time, I've got to recognize what's going on. Right? Complete restoration of a tropical dry forest. The word young matters. Complete restoration of a tropical dry forest will take 200 to 500 years. So you're not getting that back anytime soon. You're getting back something that has some of its characteristics. project is an acclaimed success, right? It employs 130 staff, all of them locals. It works closely with local communities, particularly schools, and has got praise worldwide. And this is where the academic phylogeny gets interesting. So this project, it's synonymous with his name, and that's probably unfair. I suspect that's actually very unfair to local staff. Really, I think what's gone on is it has been championed and encouraged and helped fund by a well-known ecologist, the US ecologist, Dan Jansen. So this is the same guy behind the Jansen-Connell hypothesis to do with diversity of tropical plant species, very influential in DNA barcoding and herbivory. So he's been in your courses along the way. This is what Dan gave over big slugs of his career to do, championing this restoration project. So that is one example of a large-scale restoration project. Here's another, and one that starts to blur between the ecosystem focus and the species focus. But this is one that's also talked about a lot this time in the US, which is the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park. So the national park was established in 1872, but enforcement was initially weak. There was hunting and habitat destruction that continued, and gray wolf was extirpated in the national park in the 1930s. The species is listed under the ESA in 1967. In the absence of its top predator and a keystone species, yet the Yellowstone ecosystem was transformed. Then in the 90s, 31 gray wolves are reintroduced from Canada. 20 more come in from central Idaho. The wolf population's growing, right? Went to 1,600 individuals by 2009, and there was then some downlisting of wolves under the ESA. So top predator is back, having been absent for 60 years. And the ecosystem is responding to the top predator being back around. So in the absence of wolves, elk and coyote numbers had both been greatly increasing. Both are now in decline. Their behavior has also changing. So elk behavior is shifting, and that means herbivory patterns shift. If you don't have anything to fear, then you're just going to go and forage like mad. Once your top predator's around, you change when and how you forage. The species that an example of a species people are watching is quaking aspen. That has not responded yet. But the reason people are watching it is that's a plant species that's very fundamental to the ecosystem, where its recruitment is suppressed by elk herbivory. So if the wolves suppress the elk, that might allow a release of quaking aspen, but we haven't seen it yet. Okay, so those are some ecosystem impacts. What about other impacts? There's been a lot of interest from visitors to the park. And this happens with restoration in general. So Michael said, restoration feels like to do with human interests. Sometimes restoration projects can actually have generally more human interest than the native ecosystem might have done. So this, some mineral and aggregates companies who've been doing those mining sites, not the Australian one, you'd be nearer a population center, they make their restored site a little nature center. They put in car parks and toilets, and that gets loads of people on site in a way that wouldn't otherwise have been there. So often you get interest, and that was certainly true for the wolves. You got a lot of interest from visitors to National Park. At the time the reintroduction was done, there was a lot of concern and pushback from surrounding landowners. Their fear was livestock losses, that wolves are not going to be selective about what they take. Those fears have not been met, I would argue. So in 2000, to give an example, wolves killed 7 cattle, 39 sheep, and 8 dogs. To put that in context, 40,000 cattle live in the area. So 7 lost is relatively small. And those 7, that could still be a lot if that was your family and your family's property. To try and lower the conflicts, to lower the stakes, conservation groups pay landowners for verified wolf kills. They also try to minimize conflicts. Conservation groups are buying up grazing rights on the surrounding land, but then not exercising it. That's a pretty common conservation strategy. That grazing rights go up for auction, I'm going to go and buy them as a conservation group. I'm just not then going to use them. So conservation groups have tried to minimize those conflicts. So that's another example of sort of a very prominent restoration project. Okay, so this chunk of material was giving you a flavor of restoration. How can we restore ecosystems once already degraded? And some of the principles, things like how degraded is it already? What's the goal going to be of that we're trying to achieve with our restoration? How are we going to track progress towards the goal? And then what efforts are we going to use? Is it hay bales in the stream? Is it horses pooping in the pasture? But what things are you going to try to recover the ecosystem's function? Okay, how about some questions for me? No one?
Do you have any other examples of like species-specific restoration efforts?
So we've had a few as went along. So Paul, you asked about forest restoration the other day, and I pointed you towards red-cockaded woodpecker, which is a very much a species-triggered, single species-triggered restoration effort where they're after mid-successional forest. So that kind of combination, in talking about restoration ecology, we are taking a habitat-centric vision. You can see restore ecosystems once already degraded. It's not always as clean as that, though. That last example gave you one whereby the species there was actually the method, the mechanism for restoring an ecosystem and of interest in its own, and red-cockaded woodpecker would be another. Any of those mitigation banking examples that we talked about connected to the ESA, and so the most prominent of those by sale volume. So red-cockaded woodpecker is the one that everyone talks about because it's very eye-catching, the numbers are whopping. But if you actually look at volume of trades, it tends to be things that are easier to restore. So volume of trades, people would look at things like bog turtles. Those are ones that are very species-centric, that you are restoring an ecosystem, you are in some cases creating an ecosystem, but you're doing it to produce the numbers of the endangered species. So that sort of narrowing of attention from the ecosystem to the species happens very much there because the species is actually the driver. The contrast would be things that are done under Clean Water Act, so the Section 404 bit of the Clean Water Act, their restoration is being done for no net loss of wetlands. Sometimes species are used as an indicator, usually it's a mix of species, but that's quite different from the ESA type examples where the species is the driver and the goal, the ecosystem is the means. Good question. Other questions? And Paul, you can tell from this one, right? We're going to get very species-centric in the next bit. Other questions?
Gotcha.
No others?
I actually have one more.
Go on, Paul.
This is a little bit unrelated, but it has to do with like the ecosystem creation that you were talking about with wetlands.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering what are your opinions on that? Because if they're taking a intact forest habitat and then creating a wetland out of an upland site, I feel like that could have some pretty significant negative impacts as well. So even though there's not a net loss of wetland, but
yeah. So in general, you probably heard it from me. I'm not a fan of ecosystem creation. I don't think it works. I think the overall loss type signal, these things are small scale. So they're intensive, they're focused, they're small scale. I'm less worried about it from the perspective of aggregate loss of habitat. It's more from the fact I think it's going to fail. So not the loss of forest habitat, but the wetland that you destroyed, I don't think would be mitigated by creating somewhere else. And typically what you found is people weren't advocating for ecosystem creation. People set in place policies and compliance requirements on developers. They didn't really understand what would happen when those policies and compliance requirements took effect, and developers looking at it decided that this was a cheaper way to do it. And so, as you would expect, the policy guidance starts to shift and change. The biggest failing on the policy side, by far and away though, if you look at restoration projects that are required under some compliance element, I'd say by far and away the biggest problem is a complete lack of monitoring. That you say to some developer, you need to do restoration because you destroyed habitat or you impacted this endangered species. And the law is very clear about what you need to do. That will, often developers then go and try and do it. But if no one is monitoring whether they are successful, no one is monitoring how much they achieve, then it's not a surprise there's going to be slippage in the system. And to me, that's actually the biggest policy failing in here is sort of enforcement and monitoring in the compliance-based stuff. So habitat creation, as I say, I don't think anyone really was advocating for habitat creation. People slipped into it, and if there's no monitoring and enforcement, you get more and more of it. And so to me, it's monitoring enforcement that lets us understand if the policies driving restoration are doing what we want, and if they're not, they help us refine the policies in a way that would close down loopholes that really aren't helping. But no, I don't think habitat creation in places it's not is a very wise endeavor. I think restoration, you got a better shot because at least you know the ecosystem has been there and ecosystem function is possible there. Ecosystems can change, so drying trends and things can rule things out, but at least you've got a better shot than if you're in a place that it wasn't before. Other questions? Okay, then I'm going to tiptoe ahead because this lets us see more of Vivian's material. So we're going to look at, we've done a very ecosystems thing about what happens when it all goes wrong. Now we're going to do a species-centric version of what happens when it all goes wrong. And the obvious species-centric version is ex situ conservation. And for some of you, I don't know who it is, but for some of you, this is probably why you came. So here we are, like 1.5 or one and a bit lectures to go. Finally, what you thought conservation was. This is zoos, botanical gardens, seed banks. Some of you probably think zoos are the big player in conservation. I don't. They're relevant to ex situ conservation. I think the action in conservation, much more of it is in situ. Now, what do I mean by that? In situ are conservation strategies that attempt to conserve biodiversity within wild ecosystems. Right? That's what creating protected areas is. That's what managing hunting pressure or removing invasive species is. It's trying to conserve biodiversity in the wild, in nature. Ex situ conservation refers to strategies that depend on taking things out of the wild. Might be captive breeding programs, might be rear and release programs, might be wildlife rehabilitation, might be seed banks. Right? So it's not, we're not going to try and conserve you in the wild. We're going to take you into a human managed system. It's only an option for individuals, populations, species. It is not an option for habitats and ecosystems. There have been various heroic failures where people have tried to take, I'm going to take this ecosystem and I'm going to make an ecosystem in a zoo-like environment or a botanical garden. Doesn't work. Never ever works. We can't keep enough of the functions. And so it's for individuals, populations, and species only. And this has been around for a really long time. So it's very tempting, much like we said with sort of our history of conservation and protected areas and things, to talk about the US experience, but this has been around for a long time. So the example, Père David's deer, it's been extinct in the wild since 1200 BC. The species is still around, but it's in hunting reserves that were kept by Chinese royalty and are now in captive herds. Ex situ conservation should probably be thought of as a measure of last resort. once everything's gone wrong and you're eyeballing extinction of a species, what are you going to do? Last resort, because it can get really, really expensive. The two, and I've probably been guilty of it already, the two, in situ and ex situ conservation, are often positioned as alternatives. And sometimes I think that's appropriate, right? There's times that they are in conflict with each other. At the same time, for when you get down at the level of a species, they're also often complements. So both things might go on. You might have, for example, your in situ conservation that's involving protection, management, monitoring, gets you to a viable population. A few of those are taken to establish a captive breeding program that's bringing visitors to zoos and aquaria and things, the revenues from which are then being invested back in further protection and management. So they do often complement each other when you're down at that sort of species that are in real trouble. And sometimes only one is even possible. Okay, the textbook example for this that will come up a couple of times as we move through the material is California condor. So this thing is a California condor. This is where I would stomp across the lecture theater to try and give you a sense of what 3 meters looks like. So stop for a second, right? Stick your arms out at what you think is a meter and then sort of track it across whatever room you're sitting in. That's the wingspan of this thing, right? It's huge. We had a speaker, and I've never seen one in the wild. We had a speaker in who just come from, and he'd just seen one in the wild, and he said it just brought this guy to tears seeing condor flying again. So largest bird in North America. Historical range from Baja to British Columbia, right? So covered the whole of the West Coast. Population size crashed due to habitat loss and hunting. Lead pollution was identified as a major threat. Lead from shot. So we shoot things with lead bullets. We don't find everything we kill. The carcasses are found by condors. The population size dropped to 19 individuals in 82, 11 of which had died by 1986. So this thing had been the whole of the West Coast, and you're down to 11 individuals. Right, this is what I mean by measure of last resort. What are you going to do? Iconic species down to 11 individuals. At the time, super controversial. They trapped the 11 that were left. So even that, right, you're going to try and catch alive this thing with a 3 meter wingspan without damaging the individual and bring it into captivity. Very, very controversial program. Captive breeding increased the population to about 63 birds by 92. By 2008, we had a population of 320, half of which had been reintroduced to the wild. So they have been bringing back condor. That's an example of a captive breeding program. We're going to structure the material that's coming around reasons for taking a species out of the wild. So why we might do this to promote a species' long-term conservation. They include giving it temporary protection from an immediate threat that cannot be prevented. So that might be rehabilitating individuals around an oil spill. And there was a spill in South Africa where it was really temporary. The spill was heading towards a colony of penguins, so they moved the colony of penguins, the path of the spill changed and they brought them back again. So sometimes it's just avoiding the immediate threat. So that's temporary protection from an immediate threat. Another is rebuilding a population. That one is a longer term thing. You're setting up a captive breeding population that would support wild releases, and then you're trying to either enhance existing populations or reseed extirpated ones. And the last sort of most extreme one, which is really plants only at the moment anyway, is that we're not even going to try. We're not going to try and offer protection. We're just going to go after the genetic information encoded within the species and make sure that that is stored. Species is going to be extinct, but we're going to have the genetics somehow on file. So I'll do, what I'll do with this bit of material is I'll go through examples of what it looks like to provide temporary protection, what some of the challenges are, what it looks like to rebuild a population, what what some of the challenges are, what it looks like to store genetic information encoded within a species. So that's what we will do. That's what we will start on Thursday, walking through these things that are more about what do we do when it all goes wrong, and we're focused on individual species. Why don't I finish the day with a question or two?
Have you ever seen a condor?
I said I haven't. I've never seen a condor in the wild. Love to, never have. And I mean, the individual in question is that I mentioned, the human, was a avid naturalist, spent his entire time in the field. Now, he wasn't on the West Coast, and he first saw a condor in his 70s. And this was the man who was sort of on his knees in tears when it happened. And so I haven't, I'd love to.
Can we have like a flavor of how some of these restoration projects cost?
So I have some cost numbers for you for the species, at the end of the species material. So I can show you, I will show you some costs to talk about when it comes to individual species. In terms of, I don't have numbers in here on the restoration of habitats. I have written about it, so you can find some in our papers, and I've spent some time talking about that with folks who are sort of restoration is their business. The answer is, it depends, and the key thing it depends on is how quickly you would like to see your ecosystem restored. And so an individual I work with in the UK, we've worked with his, I mean, he's a CEO of an NGO, and we've worked quite a bit with his NGO. Is a big restoration guy. His speciality in particular is peat bogs. And I talked with him about the costings, and this is where we got to this point that we realized that there isn't one cost. There isn't a price. The price depends on things like the goals, the timelines, the rapidity. And he gives the example of a peat bog restoration he was involved with in Scotland. And this thing was covered in trees, again, that didn't belong, that had been put on after World War II. But under it, there's still some of the peat. And it was the Scottish government were doing the restoration. And I mean, in that work, I can probably take a bit of digging, but I can probably get to what they paid. But the numbers were crazy because they decided they needed this thing to be restored very quickly. And if you let vehicles into the site, heavy vehicles to remove trees, you would rip up the surface layer of the peat. So instead, they helicoptered individual trees off the site. So humans walk in with the chainsaws and cut the trees, but the tree doesn't fall. Instead, or the tree doesn't fall and then get dragged out. They lifted them out one at a time by helicopter, meaning the site was restored in like 4 or 5 years. I spoke to the guy who led this restoration project, and he said that, and I said to him, what would you do now? And his answer was, now I would issue a commercial felling license for free. So he doesn't need to pay someone to cut the trees down. If he lets them keep the trees, they'll come and take them. So he says, I'd issue the commercial felling license for free. Someone will come on with this pickup and a chainsaw, take off all the trees for me. I will get to the same place with that ecosystem, but it'll take me 20 years because he will damage the surface of the peat. So he would now accept waiting 4 times as long to do it for free as to paying hundreds and thousands of dollars per hectare to clear the site. So it's a question of how fast. As I say, I can probably dig to get that out, or I can point you towards the paper. I've done quite a lot on costs, Michael, but I've tended to do it on things like protected areas, not the restoration ones. The restoration costs are quite a bit higher usually.
Thank you.
Okay, that's us up on 9:25, but it's office hours, right? So I'm going to go into office hours next. So a good number of you have done with me over the weeks. I will stay on this Zoom line. So I'll stop the slides, I'll stop the recording, But we will have office hours on this Zoom line. I usually take a couple of minutes so I can recharge the teacup, because you haven't had enough of me gulping down tea as we move through the class today. I will pick up on Thursday, when I will do more of the ex situ material, and we'll have this last outside speaker, and then we'll kind of look back across what we've covered in the course. Your coursework is due at 4 p.m. on Thursday. I'll also have more guidance for you on the final. As we said, if anyone's really troubled about a model that is a slightly bigger window, but not full flexibility, I need to have that email by sort of, later on today, because I'm going to set things in train for the revision. That's only possible if we restrict the time that the exam's open for. Okay, at that point, I'll go quiet for a few minutes, go and get my cup of tea, and we can reconvene for office hours for those who want to stay on the line. Thank you, guys.
You have a good day.